Blood doesn't wash out of $1,000 Italian leather. Marco Vitali learned that the hard way, not from a rival family, not from a back alley ambush, but from a scrawny 12-year-old kid with a black eye and a trembling finger pointed straight at him. The kid's voice cut through the crowded ballroom like a gunshot. "That's my dad!" The entire gala froze. Crystal glasses paused mid-toast. Conversations died. Every made man, every corrupt politician, every dangerous woman in the room turned toward the boy standing defiantly in the middle of the marble floor, his cheap school uniform torn at the collar, blood still drying on his split lip. Marco Vitali, the most feared underboss in Chicago's underworld, the man they called the Shadow of the South Side, slowly lowered his whiskey glass. At 32, he moved like violence wrapped in Armani. Broad shoulders, sharp jaw, eyes like black ice that had seen more death than most men twice his age. A custom charcoal Brioni suit hugged his powerful frame, the faint outline of a shoulder holster visible to those who knew where to look. For a long second, the only sound was the soft jazz quartet that had nervously stopped playing. Marco stared at the boy. The kid didn't flinch. Most adults couldn't hold his gaze for 3 seconds. This child, bruised and broken, stared back with something dangerously close to hope. A low, dangerous chuckle escaped Marco's lips. "Well, this should be interesting." The boy's name was Elias Kane. Eli to the few people who still cared. 12 years old, small for his age, with messy dark hair that never stayed combed, and hazel eyes that had already seen too much. For the last 2 years, Eli's life had been a daily war zone. Southside Public Middle School was less a place of learning and more a hunting ground. Older kids, led by a bully named Jax, made sure he never forgot he was the kid with no dad. They stole his lunch money, slammed him into lockers, and yesterday they had beaten him so badly that the school nurse threatened to call child services again. But calling wouldn't change anything. His mother, Sophia, was drowning in medical bills from her cancer treatments, and a mountain of debt left behind by Eli's absent father. Sophia worked 2 jobs. One of them was as a waitress at the exclusive charity gala hosted by the city's elite. The same, the event where the most dangerous men in Chicago conducted their real business behind champagne, toasts, and fake smiles. Eli had snuck in through the service entrance after getting another beating at school. He was looking for his mother, hoping she could patch him up before the next round of humiliation tomorrow. Instead, he had seen him, Marco Vitali, the man whose name made grown men whisper in fear. The underboss, who had taken control of the Vitali crime family's entire Southside operations in a single bloody year. The same man whose photograph Eli had kept hidden in his backpack for the last 4, clipped from an old newspaper article his mother thought she had thrown away. Eli's mother had never spoken his name out loud, but the boy wasn't stupid. He had pieced it together from late-night arguments, old letters, and the way his mother sometimes cried while staring at an empty photo frame. Marco Vitali wasn't just some powerful stranger. He was the father who had never once looked back. Now, standing in the middle of the glittering ballroom surrounded by armed bodyguards and millionaires, Eli felt his heart hammering against his ribs. His split lip throbbed. His bruised ribs screamed with every breath, but he kept his finger pointed straight at the Mafia boss. The silence stretched. One of Marco's men, a massive enforcer named Rocco, stepped forward with a growl. "Kid's clearly lost his mind. Let me toss him out, boss." Marco raised a single hand. The enforcer froze instantly. The underboss took one slow step down from the raised platform, his polished shoes clicking against the marble like a countdown. His dark eyes never left Eli's face, studying him, dissecting him, as if the boy were a puzzle that had suddenly appeared in his perfectly controlled world. A faint smirk touched Marco's lips, but his eyes remained cold. "Bold move, little man," he said, his voice low and laced with danger. "Most people who point at me like that don't live long enough to regret it." Eli swallowed hard, but kept his chin up, exactly the way his mother always told him to when facing monsters. Marco Vitali was not a man who was easily surprised. At 32, he ruled the South Side with an iron fist wrapped in tailored silk. He had seized control of the Vitali family after his uncle's sudden and very permanent retirement. In just 14 months, he had doubled their territory, crushed the rival Delgado syndicate, and turned the once chaotic docks into a machine that moved more product than most shipping companies. They called him the Shadow, not because he hid, but because wherever he moved, darkness followed. He stood 6'3", broad-shouldered and powerfully built, with sharp, aristocratic features that could have belonged to a Renaissance painting, if not for the faint scar running through his left eyebrow and the cold calculation in his obsidian eyes. His midnight black hair was perfectly styled, his custom Brioni suit worth more than most people's annual salary. A heavy platinum watch gleamed on his wrist, and beneath the jacket, a custom shoulder holster held a modified Glock that had ended more arguments than any lawyer ever could. Power radiated from him like heat from asphalt in summer. Men twice his age deferred to him. Women who knew better still found themselves drawn to the danger. Marco didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. When he spoke, the room listened. Until tonight, the boy's accusation hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. For the first time in years, Marco felt something dangerously close to genuine shock ripple through his chest. He masked it instantly behind a mask of arrogant amusement, but his sharp mind was already racing, calculating possibilities, scanning the boy's face for lies, for resemblance, for weakness. Rocco, his most trusted lieutenant, shifted uncomfortably beside him. "Boss, this has to be some kind of setup. Maybe the Delgados sent the kid to rattle you." Marco didn't answer right away. He took another step closer, towering over the small boy. The expensive cologne he wore mixed with the faint scent of gun oil and authority. Up close, Eli could see the faint lines of old fights on Marco's knuckles, and the way his presence seemed to suck the oxygen out of the room. A dark, low chuckle finally escaped Marco's throat. "Kid's got balls," he said, loud enough for the surrounding guests to hear. "I'll give him that much. But courage without brains is just another word for suicide." He tilted his head slightly, studying Eli with the same intensity he used when deciding whether to pull the trigger or offer a deal. "So tell me, little ghost, what makes you think a nobody like you could possibly belong to me?" The challenge in his voice was unmistakable. The entire ballroom waited, breathless, for the boy's answer. Eli's heart pounded so hard he was sure the whole room could hear it. His palms were sweaty, his split lip stung, but he refused to lower his hand. "Because my mum told me," he said, his young voice cracking but loud enough to carry. "Sophia Kane, she said you were the only man she ever loved. And then you disappeared before I was born." A ripple of whispers exploded across the ballroom. Someone dropped a glass. Rocco's hand instinctively moved toward his jacket, but Marco stopped him with a sharp look. The Mafia underboss stared at the boy, his expression unreadable. For a moment, something flickered behind those cold black eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or a buried memory, clawing its way to the surface. Before Marco could respond, Jax, the same bully who had beaten Eli earlier that day, pushed through the crowd with two of his older brothers. They had followed Eli, looking for another chance to humiliate him. Seeing the scene, Jax laughed loudly, trying to impress the powerful men around him. "Look at this loser," Jax sneered, shoving Eli hard from behind, making up stories about being related to a big shot. Pathetic. He doesn't have a dad. Everybody knows his mom is just some sick waitress who... Eli stumbled forward. In that split second, years of fear, pain, and anger boiled over. He spun around and shouted with everything he had left. "That's my dad." He pointed directly at Marco Vitali again, tears of rage and desperation burning in his eyes. The shove, the public humiliation, and the boy's raw scream turned the moment into chaos. Jax's brother lunged to grab Eli by the collar. The boy tried to dodge, but tripped over his own feet, crashing into a waiter carrying a full tray of expensive champagne flutes. Crystal shattered everywhere. Golden liquid splashed across the marble floor and onto the edge of Marco's polished leather shoes. The entire room went dead silent once more. Marco slowly looked down at the champagne dripping from his shoes, then raised his gaze to the trembling boy now sprawled on the floor amidst broken glass. Jax and his brothers froze in terror as they realized whose path they had just crossed. Marco's voice dropped to a deadly whisper that somehow carried across the ballroom. "Touch that boy again, and I will make sure your entire bloodline disappears before sunrise." He stepped over the broken glass and extended a powerful hand toward Eli. The boy stared at it, hesitant, terrified, hopeful. Marco's eyes narrowed. "Get up, kid. We're not done here." Eli took the offered hand. Marco's grip was firm, but surprisingly careful, as he pulled the boy to his feet. Up close, the Mafia underboss seemed even more intimidating. Taller, broader, radiating a quiet violence that made the air feel thick. The crowd watched in stunned silence. No one dared speak. Even the city officials who had been laughing and shaking hands with Marco moments earlier now looked uncomfortable. Marco brushed a piece of broken glass off Eli's torn uniform with surprising gentleness, though his eyes remained sharp and calculating. "So you're Sophia Kane's son," he said slowly, tasting the name like an old memory. "Interesting claim. Most people who try to attach themselves to me want money, or power, or protection. Which one is it?" Eli wiped blood from his lip with the back of his sleeve and looked straight into the dangerous man's eyes. "I don't want your money," he said, voice shaking but clear. "I want you to make them stop." He pointed at Jax and his brothers, who were now backed against a wall, faces pale. "They beat me almost every day. They broke my stuff. Yesterday they stole my mom's medicine money. I'm tired of being nobody's kid. If you're really my dad, then do something about it." A dark smirk played on Marco's lips, but there was a flicker of something else, amusement mixed with genuine intrigue. He turned his gaze toward Jax, who looked like he might faint. Rocco stepped forward, cracking his knuckles. "Boss, just say the word. I'll handle these street rats." Marco raised a hand again, stopping his enforcer. He crouched slightly so he was closer to Eli's eye level, his expensive suit straining against his powerful frame. "You think it's that simple, little man? You walk into my world, point a finger at me in front of half of Chicago's elite, and demand I become your hero?" His voice was low, dangerous, laced with arrogance. "In my world, kids who make bold claims either prove themselves or get crushed. There are no free handouts." Eli's small fists clenched at his sides. Despite the tears threatening to fall, he didn't back down. "Then test me," he said quietly. "I'm not afraid of you. I've been afraid of everyone else my whole life. If you're my father, prove it. If you're not, then I'll walk out of here and never bother you again." The words hung heavy in the air. Marco studied the boy for a long moment. The same hazel eyes, the stubborn jaw, the fire that refused to die even after years of beatings. A muscle ticked in the underboss's jaw. Finally, Marco stood up straight, towering over everyone once more. "Fine," he said, his voice carrying across the silent ballroom. "You want to claim me as your father, then you'll have to earn it tonight, at my private estate. We'll see exactly how much of my blood runs in those veins." He snapped his fingers. Two of his men immediately moved to escort Jax and his brothers out. Marco looked down at Eli, a predatory smile touching his lips. "Try not to disappoint me, kid. Very few people survive disappointing me." The Vitali estate sat on the outskirts of Chicago, like a fortress disguised as luxury. High stone walls, iron gates, and armed guards made sure no one entered without permission. By the time Marco, blacked-out SUV, pulled up to the private training facility behind the main mansion, Eli's nerves were on fire. Marco led him inside a large, well-lit warehouse converted into a personal gym and tactical training center. Heavy bags hung from chains, mats covered the floor, and one entire wall displayed an impressive collection of weapons and boxing equipment. A small group of Marco's inner circle had already gathered, hardened men who watched the boy with a mix of amusement and suspicion. Marco removed his jacket, rolling up the sleeves of his crisp white shirt to reveal powerful forearms marked with old scars and faint tattoos. "Here's the deal, Elias," he said, his tone cold and businesslike. "You say you're my son. You say you want protection. Fine. I don't hand those things out for free. Tonight you'll prove you have what it takes to stand in my world. Eli stood small, but straight, in the center of the mat, still in his torn school uniform. Marco continued, circling him slowly like a predator. 3 tests. 3 rounds. You'll face me directly. No holding back. If you can last all 3 without breaking, without crying, without running, I'll pay off every last cent of your mother's medical debt. $200,000. Enough to get her the best treatment money can buy. You'll have my protection. Food on the table. A future, the men in the room murmured. That kind of money was life-changing. Eli's eyes widened, but he stayed focused. And if I lose? He asked quietly. Marco stopped in front of him, towering over the boy with a dark, arrogant smile. Then you belong to me. You come live under my roof. You follow my rules. You train. You learn what it really means to be a Vitali. And you forget any fantasy about a normal life. Because once you enter my world, there's no going back. Rocco stepped forward, holding a pair of smaller training gloves and headgear. Boss, he's just a kid. This is crazy. Marco didn't even glance at him. His eyes stayed locked on Eli. This is my world, Rocco. Either the boy has my blood, or he doesn't. Tonight, we find out. He extended his hand toward Eli, the same powerful hand that had pulled him up earlier. So what do you say, kid? Do you still want to claim me as your father? Eli looked at the hand, then at the circle of dangerous men watching him. He thought about his mother, coughing blood in their tiny apartment. He thought about the years of loneliness and beatings. He reached out and shook Marco's hand with surprising strength. I'm ready. Marco's smirk deepened, a mix of arrogance and something almost like respect flickering in his eyes. Ring the bell. The training warehouse smelled of leather, sweat, and polished wood. Dim overhead lights cast long shadows across the thick mats, while the faint hum of the city felt 1,000,000 miles away, behind the thick concrete walls. By 11 p.m., more of Marco's trusted men had arrived. They stood in small groups, smoking cigars and placing quiet bets, not on whether the kid would win, but on how long he would last before he broke. In one corner, Marco prepared himself. He had changed into a black compression shirt that highlighted his muscular build and years of brutal training. His movements were precise and confident as he wrapped his hands with professional athletic tape, securing each knuckle and wrist with the care of a man who had fought his way to the top. He shadow-boxed lightly, each punch cutting through the air with controlled power. Scars from knife fights and old bullet wounds were visible on his arms, and reminders of a life most men couldn't survive. He looked every bit the ruthless Mafia underboss he was. Arrogant, untouchable, lethal. On the opposite side of the mats, Eli sat on a wooden bench. One of the younger guards had given him a clean black t-shirt and shorts that were too big for his small frame. His hands trembled slightly as he tried to copy the way Marco wrapped his own knuckles. The tape felt strange and bulky on his skinny fingers. Rocco approached the boy, shaking his head. Last chance, kid. Apologize. Say it was a stupid mistake. The boss might still let you walk out of here with some cash for your mum. You don't have to do this. Eli looked up, his hazel eyes steady, despite the fear swirling inside him. He's my dad. I know it. I have to try. Rocco sighed and walked away, muttering under his breath. Marco watched the boy from across the room. His arrogant smirk had faded into something more thoughtful. The kid hadn't run. He hadn't cried. He was wrapping his hands like he had something to prove. For the first time, a small seed of doubt, or perhaps curiosity, settled in the underboss's chest. The men around the mat whispered, "Boss is actually going through with this? Kid won't last 30 seconds. Place your bets, gentlemen. I give him 2 minutes max." Marco stepped onto the center mat, rolling his shoulders. His presence filled the entire warehouse. He bounced lightly on the balls of his feet, powerful and ready. Eli stood up. He was small, bruised, and outmatched in every physical way. Yet he walked forward without hesitation and stepped onto the mat opposite the Mafia boss. The air grew thick with tension. Marco tilted his head, studying the boy one final time. "You still have time to back out, Elias. Walk away now, and I'll pay for 1 month of your mother's treatment. No shame in knowing your limits." Eli shook his head, fists raised in an awkward but determined guard. I'm not backing out. A low, dangerous chuckle escaped Marco. Very well then. He raised his wrapped fists. Begin. Marco moved first. He didn't charge like a street thug. He circled slowly, testing the boy's footwork. His wrapped hands held high in a professional boxing stance. The men around the mat leaned forward, expecting a quick end. "Show me what you've got, kid," Marco said, his voice low and mocking. Eli kept his small fists up, chin tucked the way he had seen in old boxing videos he watched late at night. When Marco threw the first probing jab, Eli instinctively slipped to the side. The punch whistled past his ear. The second jab came faster. Eli blocked it clumsily with his forearm, the impact stinging all the way to his shoulder. The men laughed, but Marco didn't laugh. His eyes narrowed. He threw a controlled combination. Jab, cross, light hook. Eli took the first two on his gloves, stumbled on the third, but refused to fall. He danced backward on shaky legs, breathing hard, but his eyes never left Marco's hands. "Not bad reflexes," Marco muttered, pressing forward. He feinted left and threw a heavier body shot. Eli twisted at the last second, taking it on his side instead of his stomach. The blow lifted him slightly off the mat, but he stayed on his feet. Pain flared across Eli's ribs. He gasped, but kept moving. Marco's arrogance began to shift into focused curiosity. Most grown men folded under much less. This scrawny kid was taking shots and staying upright. "Again," Marco commanded, throwing another series of measured punches. Eli slipped one, blocked two more, and for a split second found an opening. He threw a wild right hand with everything he had. The punch landed harmlessly on Marco's shoulder, but the sheer audacity of it made the underboss pause. The warehouse fell quieter. Eli was breathing heavily, sweat mixing with the dried blood on his face. His arms burned. His body ached, but he kept his guard up. Marco circled again, slower this time. "You've been watching tapes. Who taught you that slip?" "My mom," Eli panted. "She said my real dad was a fighter, said I had his blood. I practiced every night, so I wouldn't be weak anymore." Something shifted in Marco's expression. The mocking smile faded completely. He threw a faster combination. Eli blocked, slipped, and even managed a clumsy counter that grazed Marco's jaw. The men watching stopped laughing entirely. By the end of the first round, Eli was bruised and exhausted, but he was still standing, still facing the most dangerous man in the room. He hadn't cried. He hadn't begged. Marco stepped back, lowering his hands. A thin sheen of sweat glistened on his forehead. He stared at the boy with new intensity. Rocco whistled softly from the sidelines. "Kid's got heart, boss." Marco ignored him. He looked at Eli with a mixture of arrogance and something dangerously close to respect. "Not bad for round one, little ghost," he said quietly. "But heart alone won't save you in my world." He raised his fists again as the second round began. The second round started with heavier intent. Marco no longer held back as much. His punches carried real power, though he was still careful not to permanently injure the boy. Each strike tested Eli's limits. Body shots that tested his breathing, hooks that forced him to slip and move constantly. Eli's movements grew slower. Pain was etched across his young face, but his hazel eyes burned with determination. He absorbed a hard shot to the ribs and staggered, yet refused to go down. Instead of retreating, he stepped forward and threw a desperate combination of his own. Wild, untrained, but thrown with raw emotion. One punch grazed Marco's cheek. Another landed solidly on his chest. The warehouse went silent. Marco paused, touching the spot where the boy had hit him. For the first time, genuine surprise flashed across the underboss's face. He had underestimated the fire inside this child. "You really believe it, don't you?" Marco said, circling. "That I'm your father." "I know you are," Eli gasped, dodging another punch and throwing a left hook that caught Marco on the arm. Mum kept a picture. "You two at some old pier." She was smiling in a way I've never seen. "She told me you left because your world was too dangerous. But I don't care. I just want you to see me." Marco's next punch slowed mid-swing. The words hit harder than any fist. He recovered quickly and pressed the attack. But his arrogance had cracked. The calculated precision was now mixed with something unsettled. He landed a clean body shot. Eli doubled over, coughing, but forced himself upright within seconds. Tears streamed down his face, not from fear, but from exhaustion and years of pent-up pain. "I'm not weak," Eli whispered fiercely. "I survived without you. I protected Mum the best I could. If you're really my dad, then fight me like you mean it." The men watching exchanged uneasy glances. This was no longer entertainment. This was something raw and deeply personal. Marco's jaw tightened. He unleashed a faster flurry. Eli slipped 2 punches through pure instinct and heart, then took the third hard on his shoulder. He spun with the impact, but stayed on his feet, throwing everything into one overhand right. The punch connected cleanly with Marco's jaw. The underboss's head snapped back slightly, not enough to hurt a man like him, but enough to shock everyone in the room. Marco stopped. He touched his jaw, staring at the panting, bleeding boy in front of him. The arrogant Mafia boss who had broken men twice his size was visibly rattled, not by the pain, but by the unbreakable spirit staring back at him. "Enough," Marco said, voice low. But Eli raised his fists again. "One more round," the boy demanded, voice hoarse. "You promised 3. Marco looked at him for a long moment. The warehouse was deathly quiet. The underboss's usual cold arrogance had been replaced by a complex storm of emotions: intrigue, doubt, and the first traces of something dangerously close to paternal pride. "Round 3, Marco finally said, raising his hands. "Let's see who you really are." The third round began in heavy silence. Marco moved with renewed focus, but the arrogance was gone. Every punch now carried weight, testing, probing, demanding answers. Eli was exhausted, bruised, and running on pure willpower, yet he refused to collapse. The boy slipped, blocked, and countered with everything he had left. His small fists landed more than once, solid shots to Marco's body and arms that proved he had been training in secret for years, fueled by anger and longing. Midway through the round, Marco fainted and landed a controlled but heavy hook to Eli's side. The boy dropped to one knee, gasping for air. The men around the mat leaned in, expecting the end, but Eli pushed himself back up. Blood trickled from his nose. Tears mixed with sweat. His voice cracked as he spoke between ragged breaths. "You left us. You left Mum when she was pregnant. She never told anyone who you were, because she was scared of your enemies. I found the letters. I found the pictures. You're Marco Vitali. You're my father." Marco froze mid-punch. The words landed harder than anything Eli had thrown physically. The underboss lowered his hands slightly. His chest heaved, not from exertion, but from the weight of the truth crashing down on him. For the first time in years, the ruthless Mafia Don looked genuinely shaken. "I didn't know," Marco said, voice low and rough. "Sophia never told me she was pregnant. I left to protect her from this life. The war with the Delgados. It would have destroyed her." Eli shook his head, fists still raised. "I don't care why you left. I needed a dad. I needed you when they were beating me every day, when Mum got sick, when we had nothing to eat." He charged forward with a desperate cry and unleashed a flurry of punches. Most were blocked, but several landed. Raw, emotional strikes, straight to Marco's torso and ribs. The Mafia boss took them without flinching, absorbing the boy's pain as if it were his own penance. The final exchange was intense. Marco threw a combination. Eli slipped inside his guard in a surprising move, grabbed Marco's shirt with both hands, and looked up into his father's eyes with pure, unfiltered emotion. "Am I your son?" he demanded, voice breaking. "Or am I nothing?" The warehouse was completely silent. No one dared breathe. Marco stared down at the battered boy clutching his shirt. The cold, arrogant underboss who had built an empire on fear and blood felt something crack deep inside his chest. He slowly lowered his fists completely. "You're my son," Marco said quietly, the words heavy with finality. "Blood doesn't lie. Heart doesn't lie." He placed a large hand on Eli's shoulder, steadying the exhausted boy. The third round ended not with a knockout, but with a broken, powerful truth finally spoken out loud. Eli's legs gave out. Marco caught him before he could hit the mat, lowering him gently. For the first time, The feared Mafia boss held his son. Marco carried Eli to the bench and sat him down carefully. One of his men brought water and a clean towel. The feared underboss himself wiped the blood from his son's face with surprising gentleness. The men in the room stood in stunned silence. No one had ever seen Marco Vitali like this. "You earned it," Marco said quietly, pulling a thick envelope from a nearby locker. Inside was a stack of documents and a black card. "The debt is gone. 200,000 transferred to your mother's account tonight. Best doctors, best hospital. No more worrying about bills." Eli looked up, exhausted but with a spark of hope in his eyes. "You're really doing it." "I always pay my debts," Marco replied, sitting beside him. "And I don't break my word." For several minutes, the warehouse was quiet, except for Eli's slowing breaths. Marco stared at the boy, his boy, and the weight of 12 lost years settled on his shoulders. "I met your mother when I was 20, Marco began, voice low. "Sophia was different. Kind, brave. She worked at a small cafe near the docks. I was already rising in the family. But with her, I felt human. We were careful, or so I thought. When the war with the Delgados turned bloody, I made the hardest decision of my life. I walked away to keep her safe. I never knew she was pregnant. She never reached out. Maybe she was too scared. Maybe she wanted to protect you from this life." Eli listened, tears falling silently. "I buried that part of me," Marco continued. "Became harder, colder. Built an empire so no one could ever touch what was mine again. But I never forgot her smile." He placed a hand on Eli's shoulder. "I was wrong to stay away. I should have looked. I should have known." Eli wiped his face. Despite the pain, a small, tired smile broke through. "So, what happens now?" Marco stood up, his powerful frame casting a long shadow. The arrogant Mafia boss was still there, but something fundamental had shifted. "You're a Vitali," he said firmly. "My blood, my son. That means protection. That means training. That means you never have to be afraid of anyone again. But it also means rules. My world is dangerous. You'll have to learn how to survive in it." Before Eli could respond, the heavy metal door of the warehouse slammed open. Rocco burst in, gun already in hand, face pale. "Boss, we've got a problem." Rocco's voice echoed through the warehouse like a gunshot. "Delgado's men. They're here. Inside the perimeter. At least 15. Someone let them in." Marco was on his feet instantly, all traces of softness gone. The ruthless underboss returned in full force. He grabbed a pistol from the table and checked the magazine with practiced speed. "Who?" Marco snarled. Rocco's eyes flicked toward one of the newer guards standing near the back. The man, Victor, suddenly looked nervous. Before anyone could react, Victor raised his weapon and pointed it directly at Marco. "It's business, boss," Victor said, voice shaking but determined. "The Delgados offered me more. A bigger cut. Protection. They've been bleeding us dry on the East Docks anyway. You've gone soft lately. All this talk about family. They want you gone, and the kid is a bonus. Leverage." Marco's eyes burned with lethal fury. "You traitorous piece of shit." Eli's heart hammered as chaos erupted. Two other guards loyal to Victor drew weapons. Gunfire exploded across the warehouse. Marco moved like lightning, grabbing Eli and shoving him behind a stack of heavy steel plates for cover. Bullets ricocheted off metal. Marco returned fire with deadly accuracy, dropping one traitor with a single shot. Rocco engaged another, cursing loudly. "You sold us out for Delgado money?" Marco roared over the gunfire. "After everything I've given you?" Victor laughed bitterly from behind cover. "You think you're untouchable? The Delgados have been planning this for months. They knew about the kid the second he showed up at the gala. They want the whole Vitali line ended tonight." Eli peeked from behind the steel, eyes wide with terror. This was the world his father lived in. Constant betrayal and violence. A bullet slammed into the plate near his head. He ducked down, breathing fast. Marco reloaded while crouched. His face was a mask of cold rage, but his eyes kept darting to Eli, making sure his son was safe. "Stay down," Marco ordered. "Whatever happens, you stay behind cover." But Eli wasn't a normal kid anymore. Seeing his father fighting for both their lives, ignited something fierce inside him. He spotted a fallen pistol near one of the downed men. His small hand reached out. The sound of more men storming the warehouse grew louder. The Delgados were closing in. Victor's voice rang out again, full of triumph. "It's over, Vitali. Hand over the kid, and I'll make it quick." Marco's jaw clenched. He looked at Eli, and for a split second, the ruthless Mafia boss showed raw fear. Not for himself, but for his newly discovered son. This was no longer just a test. This was war. Gunfire filled the warehouse like thunder. Marco moved like a shadow, precise and lethal. He dropped another traitor with 2 clean shots, then rolled behind cover as return fire chewed up the wall above his head. "Stay low, Eli," he shouted. But Eli had already grabbed the fallen pistol. It felt heavy and strange in his small hands, but adrenaline surged through him. When one of Victor's men tried to flank Marco from the side, Eli acted without thinking. He aimed and pulled the trigger. The shot went wide, but startled the attacker long enough for Marco to finish him with a deadly, accurate burst. Marco glanced back, eyes wide with a mix of shock and fierce pride. "Together, then," he growled. Father and son fought side by side. Marco provided cover fire, his movements professional and devastating. Eli, though untrained with guns, created distractions, throwing tools, knocking over barrels, and even managing to hit one man in the leg with a lucky shot. When Victor tried to rush their position, Eli hurled a heavy wrench with surprising force, striking the traitor in the shoulder and throwing off his aim. Marco capitalized instantly, putting Victor down with a single shot to the chest. The warehouse door burst open again. Delgado reinforcements poured in. Marco cursed and grabbed Eli, pulling him toward better cover behind the heavy punching bags and steel equipment. "Keep moving! Don't stop!" Marco ordered. A bullet grazed Marco's arm. He snarled in pain, but kept fighting, dropping 2 more attackers. Eli stayed right beside him, handing him fresh magazines when needed, and watching his back with raw courage. In the chaos, Marco took a hard hit to the side and stumbled. A Delgado gunman raised his weapon for the kill shot. Eli screamed and charged forward. He tackled the man's legs with all his remaining strength, causing the gunman to stumble. Marco recovered instantly and ended the threat. Father and son locked eyes for a brief second amid the smoke and gunfire, bound by blood, survival, and a new, unbreakable trust. Marco's voice was hoarse but strong. "You're a fighter, son. My fighter." They pushed forward together. Marco's aim was flawless, his tactics brilliant. Eli's bravery and quick thinking created openings his father exploited perfectly. One by one, the Delgado men fell or fled as sirens wailed in the distance. Rocco had called in reinforcements. The last attacker dropped. Silence finally returned, broken only by the ringing in their ears and heavy breathing. Marco leaned against a crate, blood dripping from his arm, but alive. He looked at Eli, battered, exhausted, but standing tall beside him. The boy had fought like a Vitali. Marco pulled his son into a tight, protective embrace, something he had never given anyone before. "You saved my life tonight," Marco whispered. Eli hugged him back, tears flowing freely now. "And you saved mine, Dad." The warehouse fell quiet, save for the distant wail of approaching sirens and the heavy breathing of father and son. Marco knelt in front of Eli, carefully checking the boy for serious injuries. His usual cold arrogance was gone, replaced by something deeper: protectiveness, regret, and the fierce beginnings of love. "You're my son," Marco said again, voice thick with emotion. "No more hiding, no more running. From today, you stand with me. We'll bring your mother into safety. We'll give her the best care, and I'll teach you everything: how to survive, how to be strong, how to never let anyone break you again." Eli looked up at the powerful man who was now truly his father. For the first time in his life, the constant fear that lived in his chest began to loosen. "Together?" Eli asked. Marco placed a strong hand on his son's shoulder and nodded. "Together." He stood up, pulling Eli protectively to his side, as Rocco and the remaining loyal men secured the area. The Mafia underboss, looked down at his battered but unbreakable son with a rare, genuine smile. The world just learned that Marco Vitali has an heir. Things are about to change in this city. As red and blue lights flashed outside, Marco looked toward the future with new purpose. A ruthless empire, a lost son finally found, and a bond forged in blood, bullets, and courage that no rival family could ever break. But in the shadows of Chicago's underworld, the Delgado family would not forget tonight. The war was only beginning. Eli squeezed his father's hand. "What happens next, Dad?" Marco's eyes darkened with promise. "We fight, we win, and we do it as a family." Lydia